How attractive is exploration in the Brazilian Equatorial Margin? Today we have with us Cleveland Jones. He is a researcher at INOG, Instituto Nacional de Oil e Gas, geosciences and geopolitics consultant. Good morning, Cleveland. It's a great pleasure to have you here in our
Very nice
program
to be
today.
with you again, Cavaya.
Thank you so much. Let me make a repairment because in the first card, I forgot to put the name Cleveland correctly. So now we have this name here correctly. Um, Cleveland, please, three approaches I have for you. First, take this opportunity to clarify, if you can clarify for us, what is and what is not equatorial margin. The second view, how attractive is the exploration for this area, currently focused in north part of Brazil, and with the vision of resource, environment, opportunity, and the coming energy transition. Please, Cleveland.
Yeah, it's a very hot topic, obviously, and because we have already had so many discoveries, for example, in Guyana, it has international implications for, especially for the companies operating there, Exxon and others now. But in particular for Brazil, which is very sensitive to its resources and areas that are under its national sovereignty and so on, it takes on importance beyond maybe the uh, uh, petroleum potential in a certain basin. The equatorial margin is a margin in the north of South America. It is not just Brazilian, just like I mentioned. It goes on to Suriname, Guyana, and on and up to Venezuela. So it is a gigantic 3,400 or so kilometers, depending how you measure it. Just in Brazil, the extent is something like 2,000 kilometers. So it's a very, very large area. Just to put it a little bit in perspective, the pre-salt, which we know well and which I have written about extensively, is an exploratory province, which is now a production region, which in total is something like 150,000 square kilometers. The equatorial margin, just the Brazil side, could be much more than that. But of course, that would be maybe a geographical boundary. The the areas that could be of interest would be a frontier region that could be defined by geological boundaries that have something to do with the favorability of accumulations of oil and gas. So, just like in Guyana and Suriname, we have very significant discoveries and ongoing production, for example, and we have more or less delineated how far these extend. In Brazil, we suppose that there's no reason to doubt that it continues, but we don't have a very good idea of exactly what we're talking about in terms of geological favorability, because that depends on much more investigation than just some seismic. And we have extensive seismic over the area. And that goes all over 2D, some 3D seismic. And the companies, of course, would have to do a considerable amount of additional seismic in order to focus their exploration efforts. So this is a very starting point situation that we have yet.
And compared to the pre-salt we have in south part of the country, is something similar or not?
Well, the pre-salt is way ahead. I mean, we have, 15 years more of studies. And in fact, that means that we know about the pre-salt much more. And in fact, as I have written many times, the pre-salt is unique in the world, maybe comparable to some of the Middle Eastern accumulations in terms of trends of geologic trends with great favorability for large fields, large accumulations. That is unique in the world. In the Gulf of Mexico, for example, way north of the equatorial margin, we do have, hundreds of accumulations and discoveries and much ongoing production for the United States. much less in Mexico, but it is not the same thing. You have very different um, favorability scenarios. The USGS has done, and it does every 10 years or so, a world assessment of basins, frontier areas, and others. And they came up, I guess, back in 2010 or 12, and they did an assessment of the equatorial margin, many of those basins, and in fact, Venezuela and Guyana and other areas. But it was not comprehensive because at that time maybe we didn't have as much information. But it did point to very significant potential accumulations. Now, that means geological favorability. That means what they think is there in terms of oil and gas, how much could be recovered, and whether it could even be recovered is another question. Their job is to point to regions, assessment units that they call, that could hold potential accumulations that might be very significant. And in fact, they are significant. Their assessment is very wide ranging because it has great uncertainty. Uncertainty
sure.
is because you don't have enough information yet. And that still applies. Petrobras, all these other companies involved, and we have many that have blocks in the equatorial margin that have begun exploration efforts, and there's still great uncertainty. We don't have excellent information about the discoveries that have been made, and there have been discoveries. Everybody focuses on the Foz do Amazonas because that is, very much in the news because of the environmental restrictions and so on. But the entire equatorial margin is beyond the coast. It is mostly far offshore where we imagine the potential might be. But as you go east and you go towards the edge of Brazil, the South American northeast edge, where it turns, then the geological trends tend to get a little bit closer to the coast, and that could potentially create more environmental concerns. Environmental concerns means possible impacts from the exploration, from the development, from the production. And those extend not just to coral reefs and that kind of, that extends to concerns about operations if there were a spill. It extends to operations if you have to have onshore facilities because, they don't exist. An FPSO there, it's not all on its own. It still has onshore facilities that have to support it.
It's more related to operational safety than the.
Exactly. But I do want to say that we are in a very different world than 10 or 15 years ago. Operations offshore have become
much more
much better operationally in terms of safety and impacts controlled and so on.
Cleveland, you and Professor Nani, you both made an assessment for the pre-salt several years ago, and you
Yeah.
reached that 100 and something
Yeah, it
billion
was
barrels of recovery.
176 to 270 billion recoverable
Barrels.
barrels. Now we're in the range of the Middle East. If you look at the equatorial margin,
Yeah,
which we did not assess, and I think it would be premature to assess it because we don't have
sure.
enough information. You need information to assess it. It's not just seismic. And I know other people have claimed, oh, there's 20, maybe 30 billion barrels that could be recoverable. Well, those numbers can be thrown about now, but they should really give a range because I think the range is anywhere from near zero to maybe much more than that even. Because near zero, if it turns out that is operationally or maybe environmentally, but I don't think environmentally would be the restriction, operationally restrictive, maybe from a logistics point, there might be restrictions or difficulties. And even from the point of view of the cycle from the beginning of exploration activities, which have already begun, but not in the entire extent, to when production starts. And that can be 7, 10, 15 years or more.
Yeah.
So if we start earnest efforts, not just Foz do Amazonas, Barreirinhas, any of these other basins which compose the equatorial margin, we're talking probably 10 to 15 years and maybe more before production begins and stabilizes and so on. So this is a very far out thing in the future. And I understand that it is important for the country to have an idea of where we might stand. But in relation to the pre-salt, if we have 30, 40, maybe 50 billion barrels recovered, we're still talking, a fourth, maybe a fifth of what the pre-salt is, and that's 20 years ahead. And we have to understand these are very different operational environment that we're talking about. The currents are a big challenge. It's not like the
Yeah,
North Sea where you have storms and so on,
yeah,
but the currents have been a challenge. Petrobras and other companies have experienced failures, which are important because they can lead
yeah.
to disasters.
Yeah, and is there any well drilled in this area to
Oh
see?
yes. I mean, we have had the discoveries. We have a nice picture, and you had. Maybe you can
Oh, yeah,
put it
sure,
on.
sure.
We can show that from this region, from the end of Brazil, the delta of the Amazon, all the way down to Potiguar Basin, which is Rio Grande do Norte state, at the corner of Brazil. There's several of those basins, and we have had discoveries already in several areas, including Barreirinhas. We have had Pará Maranhão, certainly in Potiguar, which is right at the corner. And and I think that when we talk about the equatorial margin, we should break it down and say it is much more feasible to talk about the potential in Potiguar, which at the corner, closer to facilities that already exist onshore. Rio Grande do Norte state is a hotbed of onshore activity. Oil and gas industry is present. There would be facilities that could be implemented and dedicated for offshore activities much more easily and less expensive, and maybe to make that exploration effort viable. So that's the entire equatorial margin is very attractive from a geological standpoint. Still nowhere close to the pre-salt, but it is attractive. The only thing is that the challenges are very big, and I would say those four challenges from environmental not so much, but certainly from operational standpoint, you cannot underestimate the difference in operating environment from there down to Campos and Santos basins, which are really not idyllic, but you don't have major storms, excessive currents, and so on. This makes a big difference because that increases costs, and we have a new learning curve in order to install facilities and all that. All the way from exploration to eventual, establishing production
Yeah,
platforms and so on.
yeah,
So those challenges, and then we have the geopolitical and concerns regarding how we allocate assets and efforts and
perfect.
even attention among all of the potential that we have in Brazil, other onshore areas, and certainly the
Yeah,
areas that we already know in the eastern margin.
perfect.
Not just the pre-salt. Up there, Sergipe Alagoas offshore also has tremendous potential. I would say it's almost comparable to the entire
Wow,
equatorial margin, and that is
great.
much more achievable and closer.
Yeah, great. We have a comment from Alexandre Santos. Excellent choice of this topic. Thank you. Going to the
Yeah,
conclusions, please, Cleveland. Brazil must go to the exploration or should stay and wait or something different?
I think it's by pieces. Let's start with Potiguar Basin. Let's focus, and recently we've just had licensing approved for Potiguar activities, new activities, and we've already have discoveries there, and so we should start from that corner and then move up. And that means that the area is so gigantic that you can't expect to deal with the whole equatorial margin. Let's deal with the pieces that we're more familiar with, that are more achievable, that are environmentally more you can handle better operationally. and even in terms of facilities and logistics in order to handle that. So yes, it is yes, it is a very important area to explore and to become aware of. I know you had recently another program where the point was we have an obligation to know what we have. So yes, some
That's right.
exploration has to go on, but we have to start from Rio Grande do Norte, for example, and then take it
Yeah.
easy and do our work. Petrobras and many other companies are already there, and that's where we should focus our efforts.
Perfect, perfect. Cleveland, allow me to invite you several other times to come and to explain with more details and with more people.
Oh
Probably will
yes,
be
you know
very
the other bases are also interesting, and this brings up the whole point of how we allocate efforts to different exploratory opportunities. But certainly this is a very good starting point, and the equatorial margin certainly is in the news, and we can't give up on it, but we have to do it in a very structured fashion so that we don't
perfect,
waste efforts.
perfect. This
Great.
was Cleveland Jones, and thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you here, Cleveland.
Okay, thank you, Kavayan.
Thank
Success.
you. Bye bye.